All right, so get ready because today we're gonna dive into a mystery that's, I think it's safe to say, both fascinating and pretty unsettling, right?
Yeah.
The Smiley Face Killers theory. And just picture this, okay? Young men, often college students, they disappear after a night out, and then they're found, only to be found dead in rivers weeks later.
Yeah.
And near many of these tragic discoveries, there's something else. Graffiti, specifically smiley faces. So is this. A chilling coincidence, or could it be something far more sinister?
Well, I think what makes this theory so intriguing is that it's not just some like random internet rumor or anything like that.
Right.
It originated with two seasoned detectives, Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte.
Mm-hmm.
And they noticed a potential pattern in a number of what initially appeared to be accidental drownings.
Yeah, I've read their book, and it's definitely a page-turner. It all started with the case of Patrick McNeil, who vanished in 1997 after a night out with friends in New York City. His body was later found in the East River, and the official ruling was accidental drowning. But something about that conclusion didn't sit right with Detective Gannon.
Yeah, and for good reason.
Hmm.
The autopsy revealed some puzzling details, right?
Right.
For instance, there was no water found in McNeil's lungs,
Hmm.
which is unusual in a drowning case.
Yeah.
And even more strange, there were marks on his neck, petechiae, to be precise. These tiny red dots are often associated with strangulation or suffocation, so suggesting McNeil might not have drowned accidentally.
And then there's the fact that his body was discovered much farther downriver than expected, based on the currents. So not your typical drowning scenario. This case, with all its strange inconsistencies, really planted the seed for the Smiley Face Killers theory.
Exactly. Gannon and Duarte began to investigate other similar cases across the country, and they were struck by how many young men, often college students, were found dead in rivers under what seemed like questionable circumstances. Many of these cases were initially ruled as accidental drownings, but upon closer examination, there were often details that didn't quite add up.
And in a number of these cases, near the location where the bodies were found, there was, you guessed it, smiley face graffiti. I know, smiley faces are everywhere. But is it really possible that this seemingly innocent symbol could be a calling card for a network of killers?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Gannon and Duarte argue that the placement of this graffiti is often too deliberate to be random. They found smiley faces painted in hidden, hard-to-reach locations, like under bridges or tucked away in secluded areas. They suggest that the killers are intentionally leaving these marks, almost like a signature on their work.
Yeah, it's certainly a chilling thought, and it raises so many questions, right? Like, if this theory is true, how are these killers organized? How do they choose their victims? And why haven't they been caught?
Well, it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
The FBI has officially dismissed the smiley face killers theory. They maintain that these deaths are tragic accidents, often involving alcohol consumption and risky behavior near water.
Yeah.
And from a statistical standpoint, they have a point. Young men in their late teens and early 20s are unfortunately more likely to engage in risky behavior.
And to be victims of accidents.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely true. But even with the FBI's stance, there's still a lingering sense of unease, especially when you consider some of the specific details of these cases.
Right. Let's take the case of Chris Jenkins, for example. He was a 21-year-old college student. He vanished on Halloween night in 2002 after leaving a bar in Minneapolis. Months later, his body was found in the Mississippi River.
And this case gets even more suspicious when you factor in witness accounts. People saw him being thrown out of the bar without his jacket, shoes, or wallet on a freezing Halloween night. Imagine being stranded in those conditions. Initially, his death was ruled as an accidental drowning. But later, the case was reclassified as a homicide, adding another layer of mystery to the whole situation.
Yeah, that's a tragic story. And it highlights the vulnerability of young people, especially in those transitional phases of life.
Absolutely. It raises important questions about the role of alcohol culture, peer pressure, and societal expectations of masculinity in these kinds of tragedies.
Let's talk about another case that fits the alleged pattern. Dakota James, a graduate student in Pittsburgh who disappeared in 2017. After a night out with friends, security footage captured him walking around the city, but then he vanished without a trace.
His body was found 40 days later, miles downriver, in the Ohio River. And what's particularly unsettling about this case is that there were ligature marks, basically marks that indicate strangulation, found on his neck.
And adding to the eerie similarities, guess what was discovered spray-painted near the area where he disappeared?
You guessed it, another smiley face. This time, it was found on a bridge overlooking the river.
It's enough to make you wonder if there's more to these seemingly random tragedies than meets the eye. And while we're on the topic of unsettling details, I have to bring up the case of William Hurley, a Navy veteran who went missing in Boston in 2009. He was last seen leaving a hockey game, and he even called his girlfriend to ask for a ride home. But he vanished before she arrived.
A few days later, his body was found in the Charles River. But here's where it gets strange. His cell phone, the one he used to call his girlfriend, was found smashed on the ground nearby. It's a detail that just doesn't quite make sense.
Yeah. While Hurley's case isn't explicitly linked to the Smiley Face Killers theory in the sources we've reviewed, it does add to the overall feeling that something isn't quite right with some of these disappearances. It raises the question, are we sometimes too quick to dismiss alternative explanations? Especially when the official narrative doesn't seem to fully account for all the facts.
It's a valid question, and it's one that we'll explore further as we delve deeper into the Smiley Face Killers theory. Welcome back. So before we went to commercial break, we were discussing the Smiley Face Killers theory. All the kind of unsettling details that make it so hard to just dismiss.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that, I don't know about you, but it kind of get under your skin a little bit, especially when you consider the possibility that, these seemingly random drownings might actually be the work of a network of killers.
Right. So let's talk about the Smiley Face graffiti for a minute.
Yeah.
Remember, Gannon and Duarte believe it's like a deliberate marker left by the perpetrators. They point to the fact that the graffiti often appears in unusual locations, like it's hidden from plain sight.
Many skeptics argue that the smiley face is such an ubiquitous symbol, right? That its appearance near these drowning sites is purely coincidence. So how do Gannon and Duarte address that criticism?
Well, they acknowledge that. The smiley face is common. They argue that its placement is often too specific and deliberate to be random. For example, imagine finding a smiley face painted on the underside of a bridge in a spot that's difficult to access, not easily visible to the public. That kind of detail suggests intentionality, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it definitely makes you think twice about dismissing it as just like some kids messing around or something like that. It's almost as if the killers are using the very commonality of the smiley face to their advantage.
Exactly. It's a brilliant, albeit disturbing strategy. A smiley face on its own doesn't scream serial killer,
Right.
It's more likely to be interpreted as harmless vandalism or a random act of expression. But when you consider the context, the placement, and the recurring pattern, it takes on a much more sinister meaning.
Yeah. It's a chilling thought, and it really tacks into that primal fear of the unknown, like the idea that danger could be lurking right under our noses, disguised as something totally innocuous.
Right. And that's precisely why I think this theory continues to fascinate people. Yeah. Even though it's been largely rejected by law enforcement.
Right.
It plays on our anxieties about personal safety, with the possibility that seemingly random events might actually be part of a larger, more sinister pattern.
Right. And speaking of law enforcement, let's circle back to the FBI's position on this. They've stated publicly that they don't believe in the smiley face killers theory. They're attributing these deaths to accidents.
Right. The FBI maintains that these are cases of accidental drowning, often linked to excessive alcohol consumption and risky behavior, particularly around bodies of water. And they point to the lack of hard evidence. Connecting these cases, there's no DNA evidence, no eyewitnesses, and no confessions.
So that's a logical argument, but I still feel like it leaves some unanswered questions. Like, why are there so many inconsistencies in the official rulings of these cases? Why do so many of them share similar details, like the victim's age, the circumstances of their disappearance, and of course, the presence of smiley face graffiti?
Well, that's where the debate gets interesting, Is it possible that the FBI is overlooking crucial details? Or are we as humans just wired to see patterns where none exist, especially when we're grappling with tragedy and loss?
Right. That's a profound point. I mean, when faced with something as senseless as the death of a young person, it's natural to search for explanations, right?
Right.
To try to make sense of the chaos.
Absolutely. Our brains are wired to seek patterns, to find order. In the midst of randomness, it's a survival mechanism that's helped us throughout history.
Right.
But it can also lead us astray. When we start connecting dots, that might not actually be related.
So in the case of the smiley face killers, is it possible that the grief and trauma experienced by the victims' families, combined with, the unsettling coincidences surrounding these deaths, have fueled a theory that, while compelling, might not actually hold up under scrutiny.
It's certainly a possibility, but I think it's also important to consider that our trust in institutions, especially law enforcement, isn't always absolute. You know, there have been cases where information has been withheld, where mistakes have been made, and where the full truth has remained elusive.
Which is why I think these cases continue to generate. In debate and discussion, we as a society crave answers. We want to believe that someone is accountable, that justice will be served. And when those answers aren't readily available, it's easy to start filling in the blanks ourselves. To look for explanations that might not actually be there.
It's a complex issue, and there's no easy solution. But I think this case, regardless of whether or not the Smiley Face Killers theory is true, it serves as a valuable reminder to approach information with a critical eye, to question what we think we know, and to be open to the possibility that the truth might be more complicated than we initially thought.
Yeah. So, I guess, what can we take away from this deep dive into the Smiley Face Killers theory? I mean, we've got a string of mysterious deaths, a controversial theory, and a lot of unanswered questions.
Right. I think the key takeaway here is that the process of inquiry itself is valuable, even if we never definitively prove or disprove the Smiley Face Killers theory. The act of exploring it, of digging into the details, of challenging our assumptions, it forces us to think critically and to engage with complex issues in a more nuanced way.
Right. It's a reminder that there's always more to learn. There are multiple sides to every story, and that the search for truth is often a messy, complicated process.
And speaking of learning and complexity, I think it's important to kind of shift gears for a moment and consider the broader implications of these cases, regardless of the Smiley Face Killers theory.
That's what you're referring to, the vulnerability of young people, particularly young men in these kinds of situations. So what factors contribute to that vulnerability?
I think there are a number of factors at play here. One is the role of alcohol culture, especially on college campuses. Binge drinking is, unfortunately, very common among young adults, and it can impair judgment, increase risk-taking behavior, and make individuals more susceptible to accidents or even foul play.
Right, yeah, alcohol can definitely cloud your judgment and make you more vulnerable to dangerous situations.
Another factor is peer pressure, the feeling that you need to fit in, go along with the crowd, even if it means doing things that you're not comfortable with.
Right, it's easy to underestimate the power of peer pressure, especially when you're young and trying to find your place in the world.
Absolutely. And then there are societal expectations of masculinity, the idea that men should be strong, stoic, and independent, which can make them less likely to seek help or to admit when they're struggling.
So it's a combination of factors: alcohol, peer pressure, societal expectations, and perhaps even a sense of invincibility that comes with youth.
Precisely. And it's important to acknowledge that these factors don't just affect young men. Young women are also vulnerable in these situations, so the specific risks may differ.
So what can we do to protect ourselves and the people we care about from these kinds of tragedies?
Well, I think awareness is key. Being aware of your surroundings, especially at night or in unfamiliar places, is crucial. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, if someone is making you uncomfortable, remove yourself from the situation.
And if you're going out, especially if alcohol is involved, make sure to stick with your friends, look out for each other, and have a plan for getting home safely.
Those are all excellent tips.
Yeah.
And it's also worth mentioning that there are resources available to help people stay safe. Many colleges and universities have campus security programs, escort services, and self-defense classes. There are also apps that you can download that allow you to share your location with friends or family and to send alerts if you feel unsafe.
Yeah, those are all really helpful resources. It's easy to forget that these things exist, especially when you're young and feeling invincible.
The reality is everyone is vulnerable at some point in their lives, and taking proactive steps to stay safe can make a real difference.
Yeah. Before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on one more thing: the impact of these cases on the victims' families. Regardless of whether or not there's a conspiracy involved, the fact remains that these families have suffered unimaginable loss.
That's a crucial point. These families are left with unanswered questions, with grief and trauma that can last a lifetime. So it's important that we approach these cases with sensitivity and respect for the victims and their loved ones.
Well said. Okay. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the origins of the Smiley Face Killers theory, the chilling details of specific cases, the debate over the evidence, the FBI stance, And the broader implications for personal safety and persisting our trust in institutions.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating, albeit unsettling journey,
Yeah.
Andrew Evening, even though we may never definitively solve the mystery of the Smiley Face Killer, I think. The exploration itself. It's been valuable, pushing us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to consider the complexities of truth and perception.
Absolutely. And before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We've talked extensively about the human tendency to see patterns where none may exist, especially when we're trying to make sense of tragedy. But what if we flip that on its head?
What do you mean?
What if? In our eagerness to debunk conspiracy theories and to maintain our trust in institutions, we sometimes fail to recognize patterns that are right in front of us. What if? In our desire for a neat and tidy explanation, we inadvertently overlook real dangers.
That's a profound question and a fitting note to end on. It reminds us that we should always be open to new information, to questioning what we think we know, and to never stop searching for the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be.
That's a thought-provoking point to consider, really, isn't it? Balancing skepticism with open-mindedness and trying to sort of discern real patterns from imagined ones. It's like,
It definitely is a tightrope walk, for sure. And I think that's really where, critical thinking becomes so crucial. It's not about blindly accepting or rejecting information, but about, carefully evaluating the evidence, considering different perspectives, and forming our own informed conclusions, right?
yeah. And I feel like this whole discussion about the Smiley Face Killers theory has really highlighted, the importance of media literacy as well, wouldn't you say? We're bombarded with information from, like, all directions these days, and it's up to us to sift through it all and determine what's credible and what's not.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that there are always multiple sides to every story, and that the truth is often complex and nuanced. You can't simply rely on sound bites or headlines. You need to dig deeper, examine the sources, and, be willing to challenge your own assumptions.
Well said. Yeah, I think that's a really valuable lesson to take away from this deep dive, regardless of where you stand on the Smiley Face Killers theory. It's a reminder that we should always approach information with a critical eye and a healthy dose of skepticism, I'd say.
And with a sense of curiosity, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the search for truth, even when it's elusive or unsettling, it's a journey worth taking. It forces us to engage with the world in a more thoughtful and discerning way.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground today, from the origins of the Smiley Face Killers theory, the chilling details of specific cases, the ongoing debate over the evidence, the FBI's stance, and the broader implications for personal safety and critical thinking, right?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope it's encouraged our listeners to think critically about the information they encounter and to never stop questioning, exploring, and seeking the truth.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Smiley Face Killers theory, and until next time, stay curious and stay safe.